Hi everyone, this is Professor Clark, and this is the start of our lecture on Tolstoy. Tolstoy lived an extremely exciting life and wrote some extremely interesting and important works, so this should be a fun lecture. So, if you've heard of one famous Russian author, you've probably heard of Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, or as we normally call him in English, Leo Tolstoy. Like most of the authors under discussion in this class, he was born into a noble family. His family was particularly noble, and he became a count. You can see this very dashing picture of him at age 20. Normally, when we see pictures of Tolstoy, it's of him as an old man, and we think of him as this old, serious, very important sort of prophet-like figure. But in fact, he lived a very exciting and wild life in his youth, and was quite a looker, too. He lost both of his parents when he was young. His mother died when he was a very small child, and his father died when he was 9. And this loss of the parents is something that appears throughout his literature, and especially in his debut novel, Childhood, which came out in 1852. And Childhood is a very interesting sort of novella. It created a new literary genre, basically. And it's this kind of autobiographical fiction that we still see today, that's still a really big deal in Russia today. And so it's based on a character whose life experiences are almost exactly like Tolstoy's, but he has a different name. So his name is not Tolstoy, but he is Tolstoy for almost all intents and purposes, although he's still fictional and his life is still fictional. And we see this throughout Russian literature. Following that, we see it with, for example, Gorky's Childhood. We see it in Babel's Red Cavalry Tales. And we see it today in modern Russian literature. So authors like Prilepin, they do the same thing where they take these very autobiographical characters and write fiction about them. And it is fiction, but it's also heavily influenced by autobiography. And we see similar things in other literature today, non-Russian literature. So this is a big trend in non-Russian literature today as well. Toril Moy has a really interesting article about it. If you're interested, let me know and I can send you the link. But things like A Man Called Uwe is an example of non-Russian literature that uses this same style that was basically invented by Tolstoy in his debut novel, Childhood. And themes of family appeared throughout his work, so he was always obsessed with this idea of family and what it means to make a happy family. So he has works called Family Happiness, for example. And of course, Anna Karenina is his most famous and well-regarded novel, and that's all about families and family happiness. And it begins with the very famous line, "All happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." Unfortunately, Tolstoy's family also became quite unhappy, and so, for example, one of his best-known later works, the Kreutzer Sonata, is about an unhappy family, and it's also autobiographical. So here we have a very dashing picture of Tolstoy in his military uniform, but before he became a celebrated young officer, he had a rather checkered, or not even to say checkered, he just had a bad career, a failed career as a university student. He tried to study law at Kazan University, which, as one biographer said, is something like Kansas State University. But he performed poorly and soon dropped out, which is like flunking out of Kansas State University. The only thing he did manage to do there very well was chase women and drink and gamble. And after he dropped out, he continued living a dissolute lifestyle and ended up running up heavy gambling debts. So in order to get himself under control and under the influence of his older brother, who was serving in the army, he joined the army in 1851. And as those of you who know your history know, this is shortly before the outbreak of the Crimean War. And he served with distinction during the Crimean War, including during the 11-month siege of Sevastopol from 1854 to 1855. Afterwards, he published the Sevastopol sketches, or as they're originally known in Russian, Sevastopolskie рассказы, and he published them in 1855, right after the war, or right after he got out. And they were based on his experiences of the war, but were not just autobiographical. They're extremely interesting. And he's considered to have also kind of invented the genre of war reporting. So he used his personal experiences of the war, but broadened it and used it to really bring the reader there and make the reader really feel like what it was like to be there in the war by doing things such as using the second person. So the first Sevastopol sketch is all narrated in the second person. So it's like, you do this, you do that, you go into the hospital ward, so on and so forth. And it really puts you there. And his focus was not on the heroism of the soldiers, although he did demonstrate the heroism of the soldiers, but on the horrors of war. That he was horrified by what he saw there, and it led him to become an anti-war pacifist for the rest of his life. By the time he was 30, Tolstoy had basically already invented two new genres, that of the autobiographical family fiction and that of war reporting. And he decided not to stop there. So he left the military. He was horrified by his experiences in the war, and he left the military and decided to get married. And he married a young woman named Sofia Andreevna in 1862. At the time, he was 34 and she was 18, so there was a 16-year age difference between them. As you can imagine, that caused some problems which later reappeared in his fiction. Most notoriously, a week before their marriage, he gave her all of his diaries in which he had kept accounts of his sexual liaisons with serf women. And he made her read all about them. And she was completely horrified and almost called off the wedding, but didn't. Maybe that was a good thing, maybe it wasn't. And that event of the much older groom giving his much younger and more innocent bride his diaries to read so that she could read about his rather sketchy sexual adventures was repeated in Anna Karenina, where one of the main characters, Levin, or Ljovan as he's sometimes called, gives his diaries to his fiancée Kitty. In any case, Lev Nikolaevich and Sofia Andreevna did get married, and they had a very long-lasting and productive union. They had 13 children, 8 of whom survived into adulthood, which was pretty good for the time. And Sofia Andreevna, while she and Tolstoy disagreed about many things, she was also very devoted to him, not only bearing and rearing all of those children, but she also acted as his copyist. And so she would stay up late at night working by candlelight, copying and recopying his work so that he would have clean drafts to work from. And she famously copied out War and Peace by hand 7 times. If you've ever seen War and Peace, you know what a massive, massive work that must have been. However, despite her devotion to him, the marriage grew increasingly contentious, and they basically disagreed about more and more things the longer they lived together, and the unhappiness in their marriage is something that shows up more and more in Tolstoy's fiction. Again, he wrote stuff that was definitely fiction, but he borrowed directly from his life and the lives of those close to him for many scenes in his fiction, and sort of mixed autobiography and stuff that was completely fictional. After his marriage, Tolstoy spent 6 years writing what would become one of his main works, certainly his longest work and one of the longest works of fiction ever written, and the thing that sort of really launched him into literary stardom. So he had made a big name for himself with Childhood and with the Sevastopol sketches, and he'd written some other novellas like The Cossacks, but War and Peace was his first major long work, and it was a sensation from the time it was published. The inspiration came from Tolstoy's own family, again using autobiography as inspiration. His mother was from the Volkonsky family, and he wanted to write a novel about that and about their relationship to the Decembrist uprising. What he ended up writing was a book not about the Decembrist uprising, but about the Napoleonic Wars. As he started researching the Decembrist uprising, he realized that the Napoleonic Wars were key to understanding the Decembrists. And so he created characters who were supposed to become Decembrists, but we never actually see them become Decembrists. We see their formation during the Napoleonic Wars. War and Peace is a historical novel, but it's not just a historical novel. Tolstoy did research the history and created something that we would recognize now as a historical novel, but he didn't see it that way. He said that it is not a novel, even less is it a poem, and still less a historical chronicle. So if you remember, Russian novels have always been a little bit weird. And so we had, for example, Eugene Onegin is a novel in verse. Dead Souls is an epic poem in prose. Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time is a novel made up of short stories told in non-chronological order. And so War and Peace is more like a novel in that it is a prose narrative that follows a series of main characters more or less in chronological order from beginning to end. But it's something much more than that. It's full of what are basically philosophical treatises on the meaning of history and free will and whatever else Tolstoy was thinking about. And if you haven't read it, I do highly recommend reading it, but be sure to block out plenty of time to work at it. Tolstoy followed up the triumph that was War and Peace with an even bigger triumph, that of Anna Karenina, which came out in 1878. So again, he took a number of years to work on it and rewrote it many times. No doubt Sofia Andreevna got to copy it over many times herself. And the end result was what is considered to be one of the finest novels ever written, if not the finest novel ever written. And it follows the doomed love affair of the title character, Anna Arkadyevna Karenina, who is married to Alexei Alexandrovich Karenin, and she starts an affair with Count Alexei Vronsky. At the same time, it also follows the marriage of her brother, Stepan Oblonsky, with his wife, Dolly. All the sisters, there are 3 sisters and in Dolly's family, and they all have English names. Just FYI, that was a popular thing at the time. And so Stepan, or Styopa, Anna's brother, also has an affair. And one of the things we see is how both the characters, Anna and Stepan, have affairs and basically ruin their marriages, but are treated very differently by society. So Stepan has an affair, it threatens to ruin his marriage, but society basically forgives him. But no problem, like having an affair with your nanny is not a big deal, whatever. That's the kind of thing that noblemen do. Whereas when Anna has an affair, not only does it threaten to ruin her marriage, and actually eventually does ruin her marriage, but she is ostracized by society and, spoiler alert, ends up committing suicide by throwing herself under a train because she can't see any way forward. And so it is really caught up in what was known as the woman question at the time, the issue of what we would now see as issues of feminism, the question of how much legal and social freedom should women have? What do we do about the fact that women were basically chattel, even very high class, rich women were chattel who were very limited in their ability to own property, couldn't get proper education a lot of the time, and were basically the property first of their fathers and then of their husbands, and could not seek out love or any kind of a fulfilling life. And if they did, they were ostracized by society for doing so and destroyed. And Tolstoy was certainly not a feminist, either by the standards of the day or by the standards of today. But he had a tremendous sympathy with Anna Arkadyevna. And so he really shows all the complexity of the issue of she was married more or less as a child bride to someone much older, and now she's stuck with someone who is much older and whom she feels no affection towards. At the same time, they have a child. Her decision to have an affair not only affects her, but destroys her husband's happiness and destroys her son's happiness. At the same time, she's depicted as a starving person. That's what she calls herself. It's awfully hard to judge a starving person for taking food when it's given to them, which is how she describes her affair with Vronsky and the love that she feels for him. Meanwhile, there's another relationship, another troubled relationship. So there's a trio of troubled relationships in the novel. Dolly's little sister, Kitty, is initially attracted to Vronsky, but once he begins his affair with Anna, he cuts off his relationship with her, and she ends up married to Konstantin Levin, or sometimes it's pronounced Ljoven. It's not clear which way it should be, Levin or Ljoven. And Konstantin Levin, or Ljoven, is kind of the Tolstoy stand-in in the novel. A lot of what he said and did in the novel is a direct parallel to things that Tolstoy said and did in real life, including giving his diaries to his young bride and having her read them. And it's supposed to give us, well, it's awfully hard to say what Tolstoy meant for us to do, but Kitty and Levin's marriage is supposed to give us this kind of happy example of a good marriage, but it's still a very difficult and contentious one, just like Tolstoy's own marriage. And so don't go into Anna Karenina thinking that it's going to be a happy love story. It's a trio of love stories, none of which end particularly happily, but are considered to be some of the finest examples of psychological examination of the human condition in world literature. Anna Karenina is generally considered to be a realist novel, or maybe a transition from a realist novel to a modernist novel. So it's definitely realist in many ways. I'm sure if you read it, you would recognize it as realist. But it also prefigures the modernist novel and its interest in psychological states and subjective states of being, and in the way that it moves from character to character, and in the way that it questions social values. While he was finishing up Anna Karenina, Tolstoy underwent a profound moral, spiritual, and psychological crisis. And he had a great difficulty finishing up Anna Karenina because by the time he was getting to the end of it, he despised Russian high society and really had a hard time forcing himself to finish a novel based in Russian high society. And as part of his crisis, he repudiated Russian high society. He also suffered from what we would now probably see as deep depression. He became very fearful of death for a while and had this deep phobia that he would suddenly die. And sort of repudiated everything, repudiated all of his former life. He wanted to get rid of most of his money. His wife stopped him there, but that was a huge bone of contention between them ever since, was that he wanted to get rid of most of his money and property, and she did not want to do that. And so he also repudiated most of his former work and started writing new works that were much more moral in tone. Of course, if you read things like Anna Karenina and especially War and Peace, it's full of philosophy, but he decided with his later works that they needed to be more obviously and directly didactic and moral. Most people consider his later works to be less good artistically, but they're still very interesting and still have a lot of artistic as well as social and moral and sort of historical value. He also espoused nonviolence and the idea of nonviolent resistance to political tyranny. And his ideas became very influential on significant 20th century figures such as Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. And he engaged in a lot of correspondence with people all over the world and ended up spreading his ideas all over the world, and a sort of a cult sprang up around him in his later years. And I believe there are still Tolstoyans living in Canada, that people emigrated from Russia to create a Tolstoyan commune, and I believe there are still some in existence in North America. That's about it for this incredibly interesting character. Of course, that's not it. There's so much more that could be said about Tolstoy, but that's a quick overview. If you want to find out more about him, let me know and I can send you some resources. There's a great biography of him, and there's also a fun movie of him starring Christopher Plummer and Helen Mirren called The Last Station, and it's in English. So if you want a movie about Tolstoy, that's a good place to start. Happy reading, everyone.